can share it with the people who could not be here in Copenhagen today. So it's just so you know, it will mainly be the speakers up here, of course, that are recorded, but just so you know that questions and comments and so on will also be recorded. After my initial welcome here, we are very honored to be able to present two great international keynote speakers, Tim Ingold and Albena Yaneva. Both of them had planned to be here in real life today, but unfortunately, due to various difficulties with traveling these days, they will instead give their presentations online. So they will join us, but online. After their speaks, there will be some wine and snacks just outside here. So we hope that you will all hang around for a while and celebrate this publication with us. But first, I will just say a few words about the book and the process of writing it. First of all, I'd like to thank my co-editors. Most of them are here today. It's Claus Bech Danielsen, who is a professor of architecture and my close colleague here at Build. He's over here. It's Einar Landsberg Hagen, who is an anthropologist and senior researcher from Oslo Metropolitan University. It is Eli Støre. Where are you, Eli? Down here. Professor of Architecture from the Norwegian University of Technology in Trondheim, and Sten Kromark, Professor of Architecture from Chalmers University in Göteborg, who could unfortunately not be here today. It has been immensely rewarding to work with you. Though our publisher was slightly reluctant to have such a large group of Scandinavian editors, I think it has actually worked quite well. 3 years ago, we held the first workshop of the network here in Copenhagen. And since then, we've also had workshops in Göteborg and in Oslo, gathering a lot of interesting people working in the intersection between architecture and anthropology. Luckily, that was back in the time where traveling and gathering people was still uncomplicated. Then the pandemic came and isolated us all in our home offices. And the only space that we shared were the little segments of our surroundings showing up on the screen as this Zoom background that you all know. Yet that also gave occasion to think and write about how to explore lived space, which is the subtitle of the book. I would also like to thank the 27 other contributors who have written chapters of this book. Several of you are here today, and several have engaged in co-writing architects and anthropologists together, exploring and developing this cross-disciplinary field through the process of writing. The book includes chapters by prominent international scholars like Tim Ingold, Albena Yaneva, and Sarah Pink, who have all been very important sources of inspiration. And it includes chapters by a range of leading researchers from Nordic universities, architectural schools, and architectural firms. So thanks to you, reading this book takes us to the most fascinating places and gives truly interesting insight, at least I think so. To mention but a few, I'm not going to talk about all the chapters, of course, but there are chapters zooming in on the very intimate interiors of former homeless people trying to make themselves at home in Copenhagen. This is actually the collage that is the front cover is from that chapter. Chapters on Greenlandic prison walls and remote islands that we use to forcefully domesticate people and restore normality of society. There are chapters on the progressive urbanism unfolding on the rolling hills of a Colombian favela, on a redesigned library in Oslo and a university campus in Toronto, where the architecture is aimed at inclusion of various user groups, yet the architectural anthropological explorations show that the built environment takes part in social life in different ways than expected. And the authors point to more refined and more radical ways of working with inclusion and involvement. The book shows new ways of approaching homes, walls, boundaries, urban space, and everyday life. And it provides new tools to rethink processes of creativity, participation, and design. But it also gives new critical insight in the relationship between architecture and social life, stressing that we build walls both for keeping in and for keeping out. By way of all these different chapters and perspectives, this book takes us one big step further in developing the potential of architectural anthropology. One thing that stood very clear to me when editing this book was that we should not think of architecture as designed objects or delimited buildings. Rather, we need to approach architecture as a relationship between ourselves and our surroundings. It involves buildings, of course, but it also involves mold and microbes, walls and views, sound and smell, legal and financial structures. All of these interact in our ways of inhabiting the world, intervening in where and among whom we belong. To fully grasp such entanglements and design more livable and sustainable buildings and cities in the future, we need new cross-disciplinary approaches combining anthropology and architecture. So, in this book, we suggest that architectural anthropology is not just about scrutinizing architecture anthropologically, nor is it just a way of using ethnography as methodological inspiration for architects. Rather, we explore how both disciplines can be transformed by engaging with one another. And we show that architecture is not just about designing buildings, it's also a mode of study and inquiry. And that anthropology is not just about inquiry, it can also join with and learn from the productive process. So, where do we go from here? Both Vitruvius and Le Corbusier placed a man with perfect universal proportions in the center of their architecture. I guess current architectural anthropology would probably be slightly more woke and include women, children, people of various genders, ethnic backgrounds, different bodily proportions, as well as non-human species. And this last point is particularly interesting. The humanistic approach has long been a hallmark of Nordic architecture and urban design. Architects and anthropologists in this region have always shared interest in the relationship between human beings and their spatial surroundings. This is still important, but it is not enough. The current crises of climate and biodiversity tells us that we need to open up to a more than human world. It is time to question such human-centeredness and explore how we create worlds both for humans and for non-humans. So perhaps we could use architectural anthropology to build in less anthropocentric ways, paying much more attention to how the built environment entangles with the social life of both humans and non-humans. This is important because the global building sector is currently responsible for almost 40% of global carbon dioxide emissions. Over the next 40 years, we will be adding a building volume equivalent to that of Paris to the planet every single week. My own institute is called Build, almost as an imperative or an order, but really we need to slow down. And if we cannot stop building, we must at least find ways to build back better. This term is currently promoted by OECD and other international stakeholders. And the point with it is that after a crisis such as an earthquake or currently the COVID pandemic, we should not just build in order to get back to business as quickly as possible. Instead, we should take the opportunity to increase society's sustainability and resilience. And this cannot be done by material and technical solutions alone. human beings as social beings is really key in that process. So therefore, I believe that an important contribution is to combine anthropology's profound understanding of social life with architecture's unique ability to create and innovate the way we live. I look very much forward to developing all of this further with all of you. And now, first of all, I look very much forward to, and I'm very proud to, give the word to the next speaker, who is Tim Ingold. He is Professor Emeritus of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. Tim Ingold has written extensively on human-animal relations, environmental perceptions, lines, walking, art, and architecture. And we are very proud that he has also written a most inspiring foreword to this book. So welcome, Tim, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marie. And first of all, I'd like to apologize for not being with you in person. There we are. It's a shame, but at least I can join you virtually. And later on today, I shall join you in drinking a virtual glass of wine. I also want to congratulate Marie and Klaus and Aina on this wonderful looking volume. It's very beautifully produced. And one of the most impressive things about it, I think, is the front cover, which has a real picture on it. I don't know how you managed to persuade Routledge to do that. Most books who publish with Routledge have to put up with the ghastly corporate covers that they insist on putting on their hardbacks. So I would like to know at some stage what the secret was that enabled you to get around this policy. It's very important, I think, that this book is entitled Architectural Anthropology. It's not the anthropology of architecture, or it's not about anthropology for architects or architecture for anthropologists. It is architectural anthropology. And I want to talk a little bit about what I think this really means. And I might do that by contrasting what architectural anthropology is or could be with an anthropology of architecture, or alternatively, ethnography for architects. These are very different procedures, I think. For some reason, which is not well understood, architecture came relatively late on the scene in most anthropological investigations. There are precedents, like a famous study by one of the fathers of anthropology, Lewis Henry Morgan, of architecture and building of North American native populations. But by and large, architecture came rather late to anthropology, which was much more interested in art. So there's a huge literature in the anthropology of art, analyzing all kinds of native productions and looking at their symbolic meaning, how they represent belief, ritual, and kinship, and so on. But not so much about architecture. I think one of the reasons for that is that this sort of anthropology was very much based in museums, and there was lots of art in museums because it could be collected and transported from different parts of the world and put in Western museums. You couldn't really do the same thing with buildings. So there weren't all these buildings in museums for anthropologists to study. But be that as it may, the principal focus in the anthropology of architecture, as in the anthropology of art, has been to study the works themselves as finished objects, which somehow embody symbolic codes, symbolic meanings, which somehow encapsulate social relationships in some way or another, rather than entering into the process of building or constructing itself. And it tends always to encompass the creative impulse in human making within the contextual frames of culture, society, or history. So it puts people inside these boxes. On the other hand, an ethnography for architects tends to home in on what anthropologists often claim to be their special method, that is the method of long-term participant observation. And it's true that by doing studies through participant observation of the way in which people use the spaces they inhabit, that such studies could yield quite useful information to help us design spaces that are easy, safe, and congenial to live in. But that kind of ethnography for architects comes pretty close to what in the field of design is called user-centered design. It's trying to create environments that are nice for people. It's a form of service provision which treats the people themselves as consumers rather than producers. They're not themselves involved in the production of architecture. Rather, you go and collect information on how people are using spaces to help you design better buildings, which will then be used by consumers. So that's the anthropology of architecture, or ethnography for architects. But by contrast to both of these, anthropological architecture must, or rather architectural anthropology, I don't know which way around to put it, architectural anthropology or anthropological architecture, I don't know if it makes any difference, but it starts off from the idea of architecture not as consisting in buildings, but as a discipline of study. I mean, architecture, like anthropology, then becomes a mode of inquiry. And it's a mode of inquiry that is interested in materials, in structures, in surfaces, in atmospheres, in the kinds of multi-sensory environments that we can construct for both humans and non-humans. And if we start from that idea of architecture as a discipline, then buildings are things that in a way ask questions. Buildings ask questions of their inhabitants, of materials, of the environment, and architects then are there to listen and to respond to these questions. So that I think of architecture as I think of anthropology, as a kind of correspondence, of a way of going along together with things in the world, asking questions of them and responding to what they tell us. So then we have to think of anthropology too, not so much as a form of cross-cultural comparison, nor as a way of collecting ethnographic data, but as part of a broader inquiry into the conditions and possibilities of human life itself. So the architectural part is that we're investigating these conditions and possibilities through a correspondence with the structures and forms and materials in the world around us. And I think the possibility of such an architectural anthropology is something that has arisen quite recently, maybe in just the past 2 or 3 decades. It's arisen as a result of an upending of the Enlightenment doctrine of progress that had informed most of our inquiries up to that point. According to the Enlightenment, of course, the world is basically there for humanity, and human progress can be measured in the degree to which humankind has asserted its own superiority and control over the world around it. But if we can't actually have both that notion of progress and an idea of sustainability, we have to choose between one and the other. And I think the emphasis has now tipped decisively towards sustainability. And in that case, we are thinking not about how can humans continue to progress, but we are thinking about how life can actually carry on in this world. And it's a world, of course, that is not reserved for humans, but teems with non-human vitalities of every possible kind. And so to produce a sustainable world, we have to engage with vitalities. So an architectural anthropology is one that works through and with all these different vitalities. Now, the volume itself is divided into 3 parts. The first part is entitled Home, Walls and Boundaries. Second part is entitled Urban Space and Public Life. And the third part is entitled Creativity, Participation and Design. And in what follows, I'd like to say a little bit about each of these three themes. In each case, looking at, well, what would it look like from the point of view of an anthropology of architecture? What would it look like if we thought about it from the point of view of ethnography for architects? And finally, what would an architectural anthropology actually have to say about these themes? So if we start with the theme of home, walls, and boundaries. If you were an anthropologist of architecture, you would probably start off by looking at houses, at buildings, and you would look at the ways in which these buildings, in a sense, scaffold the activities of those who live in them, of residents, and maps out these activities symbolically. There are plenty of classic examples in architectural, in anthropological literature. Many people will be familiar, for example, with Pierre Bourdieu's classic analysis of the Berber house, where you have a map of the house, and he shows how the house, in a way, acts as a sort of template for the human activities that go on inside and around it. So that's how an anthropology of architecture would do. If you were doing ethnography for architects, you go into people's homes and collect data through participant observation on the activities and experiences of residents. And then you bring this data back and use it to inform a subsequent design process in the design of new homes, perhaps better homes, comfortable homes, based on that well-worn principle that design is supposed to make life easier for everybody, although I don't think it actually does. So, but if you were involved in architectural anthropology, how then would you treat the home with its walls and boundaries? And I think the answer is that you would treat the home as a site of experimentation, a place where you can find things out. And I'd like just to give one example of this, which I've been thinking about recently, just for the background. It comes from an exhibition in Des Moines in Iowa, in the United States. It was called Loom, Harp, and they took a rather dull interior room, which had 4 walls and a floor and a ceiling, and they put a loom inside it and an aeolian harp, which was operated by the wind outside it, and kept the loom and the harp in communication with one another, and tried to use this communication between the loom inside and the harp outside to transform the experience of the interior space. And I was thinking about that and wondering, why is it that we humans, normally, when we find ourselves inside the room of, in that case, maybe an art gallery or the room of our home, why is it that we immediately find ourselves in what we call a space and perceive the walls, the floor, and the ceiling before anything else? So why is it that we imagine ourselves inside this kind of container? And I compared this situation, thinking, I was comparing it with, for example, the situation of a worm in the soil, or a fish in an aquarium, or even a fly flying around in this particular room. If you were a worm and you lived in one of those raised vegetable beds that people construct in urban environments nowadays, which is made of sort of a box with wooden sides filled with earth, and then you plant the vegetables inside the earth. Now, if you were a worm inside one of these boxes, would you see yourself as an inhabitant of the wooden box, or would you see yourself as an inhabitant of the soil? And I'm in pretty little doubt that if you were a worm, you'd see yourself as an inhabitant of the soil. You might bump into a bit of wood now and again, but then you turn around and go back into the soil again. If you're a fish in an aquarium, again, I think, although you might sometimes bump your nose against a fish have noses, whatever it is, you bump your glass, you would say, what's this, and swim back again. You would sense yourself as an inhabitant of the water. And if you are a fly flying around inside a room, you would sense yourself as an inhabitant of the air. So I thought, what would it take for people to imagine themselves in the same way as inhabitant of the air rather than an inhabitant of a box made with 4 walls, a floor and a ceiling? And I thought, well, one way to do this might be to fill the whole room with smoke, maybe inhalable smoke, that is so thick that you can't see, I mean, like a fog, so you can't actually see even as far as your feet. Everybody would find themselves moving around in this swirling mist and occasionally bumping into other people and perhaps bumping into the walls. All they would be able to see would be this swirling fog and not the walls, so that their perception of this space would be transformed. And I thought, well, that's not such a ridiculous thing when you compare it with the experience of people who are visually impaired. They also describe experiencing, if you're blind or partially blind, you're inside a room full of people, and you have this sense that people suddenly emerge out of nowhere and then disappear again. And if you come close to a wall, you don't actually see the wall because you're visually impaired, but you feel this kind of pressure on your face because of the way the air is reflecting, bouncing off the wall. So if you immediately have this kind of perception of the space, not as a bounded container, but as an infinitely variegated, moving, whirling mass of air. So that's just an example of how one can use the home as a site of experimentation to think about things like, well, what if buildings were not really made of brick and mortar at all, but actually made of air, which we breathe? So that's the first theme. The second one, the second theme is on urban space and public life. Now, again, if you were an anthropologist of architecture, and you were looking into writings on urban space and public life, you'd probably actually find it somewhere else. You'd find these writings in quite extensive literature on space and place. There's a lot of literature on that in anthropology, which has surprisingly little to say about architecture itself. It dwells largely on questions of the distinction between domestic and public life and things like that. If you were into ethnography for architects, well, you would collect data on the uses of urban space to inform a process, and that process is usually known as planning. So, and planning is, of course, helping to design congenial urban spaces. But again, if you were doing architectural anthropology, then I think you would imagine the city as a great human experiment, an experimental place where you can, or environment where you can study things like place, space, and movement, weather, seasonal variations, what it means to belong, how the flux of social life can be reconciled with the fixity of the urban fabric. And of course, much of this concern today is revolving around the question of infrastructure and how we imagine the relationship between infrastructure and superstructure in the city. And so I'd just like to give you another example that I've been thinking about recently, which relates to the questions of climate change. Because by and large, until fairly recently, planners and urban designers have assumed that the city has to be built upon a solid foundation. Now, the problem is that in many places where cities are built, the ground, the earth itself, is anything but solid. For example, much of Paris is completely waterlogged underground, and it's the same in many other cities, Amsterdam, for example, Venice. One can think of many, many cases where the natural ground on which a city is founded is anything but solid, but actually rather sludgy, muddy, rather unstable. And a lot of engineering work then has to go into draining the water away in order to provide the solid base upon which the city can be built. Even in London, for example, we have the Thames barrier, which prevents the Thames from otherwise flooding the city. So the idea is to take what is a rather wet earth and drain it so that the liquid drains away and the buildings are placed upon the solid ground on top. But actually, when we look at our buildings in the city, we find that they're effectively floating in what is a waterlogged soil underneath. I think you could even compare buildings. One could compare the city to an ocean and compare buildings to ships, and imagine that these buildings are floating, buoyed up by the earth in much the same way as ships are buoyed up by the ocean. And what it leads one to think is can we, as rainfall increases, as lands become flooded, can we continue to invest in this idea that we build upon a solid base and try and drain the water away? Or should we, alternatively, as some urban designers have argued, plan for a world of wet, a world which is where the earth is naturally saturated with water, and start to build differently in a way that our buildings do actually float in the earth rather than standing solid on them. And so that's, again, is an area in which one can treat the urban environment as a site of experimentation for new ways of building and dwelling that might be fit for a world that is looking as though it will be very different from the one that we've been accustomed to up to now. And then the final theme of the volume is on creativity, participation, and design. Now, if you are an anthropologist of architecture, you would tend to start always from the completed works. Here are buildings, here are structures that have been made by the people we're studying. And that kind of anthropology has no real grasp of the creative processes that actually bring these structures into being. It makes it look as though people are more or less bound to the reproduction of their traditional structures. What Christopher Alexander called unself-conscious architecture, which people in non-Western cultures are simply reproducing their cultural schemes in the structures that they build on the ground. And if there's any innovation at all, it takes the form of a sort of bricolage, which you combine elements in different kinds of ways. And ethnography for architects, on the other hand, would practice a kind of user-centered design, which again positions inhabitants as consumers of an environment designed and built, not as producers. So although today community participation has become a kind of mantra for good practice, it's what everybody is supposed to do, it is in practice very much a panacea, in the sense that participation is largely sort of consultation, in which you go into the community, find out what people think, collect lots of data, but the actual creative design then is reserved for the data gatherers, for the people who collected all the data, rather than the people themselves. There's a sort of analogy with much that goes on nowadays in science, where nowadays scientists are supposed to respect and gather the so-called traditional knowledge of indigenous people. But the idea is that this traditional knowledge is just data which they can use to design programs for those indigenous people, not that the indigenous people should actually participate in the design process itself. But I think an architectural anthropology should stand for participation as genuine co-creation. It could locate creativity, where it could locate the creativity of the design process, not in some exceptional faculty of creatives. It's a word I hate. Everybody's talking about designers, architects, and so on, even film producers, as creatives. As somehow these people had some kind of creative power that other people don't have. It's the most terrible term. But we should find creativity instead in the generative potentials of the social relationships in which all are involved. Creativity, in that sense, is ecological. It's a function of the whole system of relationships in which we are involved. And of course, there's friction and there's resistance in the design process, but the boundaries of inclusivity and exclusivity in it are always shifting and variable. So we're in a era today where neither anthropology nor architecture can any longer appeal to any sort of doctrine of human exceptionalism or to the human conquest of nature or the colonization of culture. Today, we find ourselves in a situation where both for architecture, for architects and for anthropologists, we have to open out to a more than human world and to a whole range of human experience. And in that situation, architecture and anthropology can also open up to one another in a common bearing on designing environments for collective life. And I hope then that will be the way forward for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. It's fascinating to think of our cities as floating and ourselves as worms in the soil or fish swimming. I think we should have time for a few questions or comments. If anyone wants to. Yeah. We'll just give you a microphone to make sure that Tim can also hear what you're saying.
Thank you. Just very briefly, my name is Carsten Weber. I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not an architect, but I come from philosophy. And you said something that triggered me to, it's not really a question, it's more like an invitation to continue the line of thought. You said two things. One was the opposition between progress and sustainability, which I think is a false opposition because both of them are based on the logic of a human relation to the environment as an object of use. So it simply says we should change our mode of use from progress to sustainability, but it doesn't challenge the logic of human relation to the environment. But the other thing you said was the worms. Why do we perceive us as living in boxes rather than living in, whether it's air or something? And I think that exactly challenges this logic and opens up for going into redefining our relation to the environment. So I think you started on this, and I'm really curious to hear what happens when you continue on that line.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I didn't, and I should have explained myself a bit more on progress and sustainability, and I suddenly stopped because I thought otherwise I'll spend the half an hour on that one. But I actually want to think about sustainability differently. I mean, that I know that in the bulk of the discourse on sustainability, it does continue to treat the environment as an object of use. But I want to define, I don't think we should abandon the concept of sustainability. I don't think we can do without it. But I do think we need to redefine it. And in my redefinition of sustainability, it's simply about the continuity of life. It's about life carrying on, which implies nothing about the objectification of the environment or human-centeredness. So, and it's in that sense that I feel that the Enlightenment doctrine of progress, of of the gradual human mastery and transcendence of nature, which puts humans up at the top of the pyramid and turns the rest of the world into resources, cannot be reconciled with an idea of sustainability, which is which means the possibility for life of all kinds to carry on indefinitely. And elsewhere, I've argued that for sustainability to mean anything at all, it has to be the sustainability of everything for all time. and we have to work, and that entails rethinking rather fundamentally the position of ourselves as human beings in the world. And there, I think, the worm, which I mentioned, can indeed help us rethink the world in that way. We can take a worm's eye view and see ourselves as the inhabitants of what I call a plenum, not moving around in a vacuum, a world of objects, but actually inhabiting a world of continuous matter. And anyway, that's another argument. But thanks.
Thank you. I guess we should move on to Albena, but thank you very much, Tim, for joining us and for this very inspiring talk. We will try to go forward with thinking about sustainability in new ways and of ourselves as worms, perhaps. Thank you. And then I would like to say welcome to the next speaker, who is Albena Yaneva, who is hopefully also with us online. I will just introduce her. Albena Yaneva is a professor of architectural theory at the University of Manchester. Her research crosses the boundaries of science studies, cognitive anthropology, architectural theory, and political philosophy. She is the author of several books and has contributed to this book with a very useful introductory chapter providing 6 suggestions for the method of architectural anthropology. Welcome, Albena, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marie. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. I was hoping, of course, to be in Copenhagen, and I don't have the pandemic to blame this time. No humans, no known humans, just a human. My younger son is to blame, so I really apologize. I really wanted to be here with you and celebrate this wonderful book, which I'm very proud of. And I thank Marie, Anna, and Eric for the wonderful curatorial work they have done on the volume. And thank you, Tim, for this wonderful introduction into the volume and the 3 topics from the perspective of architectural anthropology. So the way I would like to contribute to the discussion today is to discuss a very recent project of architectural anthropology, where I look at architectural practices during the pandemic as a site of experimentation. So I will now share the screen. I prepared some slides presenting this work, especially for this event. I will share the screen. You can see the slides now, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll talk about close and distant readings of design practice. And this is a small experiment I conducted during the pandemic, starting with a small inquiry with architectural practices from Italy during the first lockdown in April 2020, and then a follow-up experiment, anthropological experiment, which I'll introduce shortly. So over the past year or so, COVID-19 invaded our studios, homes, and urban spaces, and gradually affected the day-to-day reality of architecture making. Yet what exactly makes this enigmatic non-human and the disturbances it triggers so interesting for us as architectural anthropologists? That's my question. So how is this little troublemaker on our paths, in our studios, changing the state of things in architecture as we speak? And what new variations of practice does it enact? Trapped in our homes or studios, unable to travel or escape, we began rethinking our own working habitat and our habits as practitioners and the spatio-temporal envelopes of our design worlds. Group meetings around scale models and walls with renderings, as well as visits to the construction site, became forgotten rituals missed by many. Yet other activities continued and took new shapes. As we engaged in pragmatically remodeling the working habitat of practices, spatial routines and epistemic habits mutated and new settings of architectural production emerged. New formats of communication, new types of teamwork activities, new type of creative activities as well. So in brief, the architecture of architecture changed as the pandemic prompted us to engage in redesigning both the spaces and the techniques that define architectural practices. To understand how the shift to online working is redefining the creative apparatus of architects, I devised a small actor network theory inspired experiment with 130 practices from 40 different countries. So these are some of the countries that you see on the screen participating in the study. So I asked practitioners to describe ethnographically one particular situation from their firm, one particular situation that illustrates how their working routines adapted to COVID-19 restrictions. And this was in a way to test what truly defines the practice, what they depend on, what threatens their interdependencies, and how they respond to them. This exercise tested the new ways invented by architects to situate themselves differently in the world of practice. Designers described as thickly as possible, as thickly as they could, one moment from their daily work to illustrate a different way of doing things. During the pandemic, a particular adjustment, a new configuration of relations. This included aspects such as technical innovation, modes of visualization, new relational dynamics between firms and connected industries, new creative habits, new ways of imagining the users or the building. These descriptions brought together specific projects, contexts, people, material settings, spaces, and the specific attachments to a variety of non-humans. They provided me as an anthropologist with a way of being there in these practices. Architectural firms from distant parts of the world became accessible through these descriptions and their work accountable. Like in many other fields in architecture, face-to-face meetings were replaced by online meetings during the pandemic. Zoom, WeChat, Teams, and other apps helped us to do this. Following designers at work, as anthropologists have done in the past years, usually lead us to witness how the course of action is constantly interrupted by the intrusions of many non-humans designers depend on. A disobedient model, a software, a difficult terrain, or a new code. Tracing architecture in the making means to never lose sight of these numerous surprises that continually slice the course of action. It is hard to imagine architectural practice without them and without the immediate presence, the spontaneity of exchange, the interventions, the mistakes, the little steps. As LA architect Kevin Daly says, and I quote, "I miss the routine reveal of small steps, and the team misses the edits and the course of corrections that are implicit in seeing in the small variations on central ideas. Collectively, we miss the experience of an entire team standing around a table, seeing the same physical thing at the same moment. Unable to gather around models or walls full of visuals, as one architect from Italy called this is our detective wall, which we see here on this slide. So unable to gather around those walls and tables with visuals, designers worked from distance. From the very first questionnaire I did with 23 practices in Northern Italy in the first lockdown, I have seen that this affected particularly hard, small-scale practices, the fact that they were not able to share these walls and tables together. The missed togetherness is, however, never about a subjective presence or the magic of the office as a place. It is rather the missed presence of a materialized version of the collective brain, which we have here. The collective brain is displayed on this wall or on a table, allowing architects to follow their gestures, the movement of their hands, allowing them to see how some ideas pass through their hands, connect to the model, and then go back to visuals and other humans. All these routines have been interrupted. The interruption acted as a bridging experiment. And here I refer to Garfinkel's bridging experiments. The bridging experiment, the bridging of the routine fabric of social life, the bridging of the invisible rules of social life is what Garfinkel refers to. So the pandemic, in a way, acted as such a bridging experiment that revealed some latent development in practice. This bridging experiment tested how practices organize their acting together, what rules they follow and require to be followed. Testing new possibilities and revisiting old habits, architects devised new scenographies of architecture, making new configurations of relations between humans and non-humans emerged when the usual ways of doing architecture were interrupted. The pandemic made designers slow down, go back, step aside, look around, and eventually speed up, engage in new compositions, in new hybridizations. A strange dance, indeed. In what follows, we'll follow three of the moves of this strange dance. First, going back, the important returns. Deprived of the opportunity of seeing little steps, the hardest challenge for designers during the pandemic was the brainstorming for ideas. Here is Duarte Vaz, a Brazilian architect, and he tells us that their solution was to return to more primary designs, I quote, primary designs without sophistication, end of quote. This was their way to adjust to making drawings on the screen with a level of quality comparable to what they do on paper. Look at them discussing and designing together. I quote Duarte again. The body posture and the way of expressing orally in front of the screens are considerably different from situations where we're all together in a room and we are more expressive. So we see that the precious ritual of collective design by drawing, sharing insights by gestures, is now replaced by design by talking, by articulating ideas verbally. And this also allows some architects which were more silent before to articulate better their ideas now. So this new disposition also activates different type of expertise and mobilizes architects who haven't been able to express themselves in previous creative settings. The diluted immediate presence of the body in design communication is compensated, replaced by more verbal and written forms of expression. And we can see this happening in other firms. So for instance, Argentinian architect Diego Arregada asked his collaborators, don't draw your idea, but tell me precisely the precise set of steps, information, and criteria that supports your design proposal. In a way, he also did a small bridging experiment, especially designed for his collaborators. So he told them, don't draw, just talk, express yourself first and then draw, which is exactly the opposite of what happens in reality. In a way, this is a small bridging experiment as well. So explaining design ideas on the phone, which was very strange for the architects from Diego's practice, but they nevertheless had to do it, explaining their concept on the phone, verbally, sharing ideas. The practice tested if they could arrive to the exact same result without looking at each other's drawings. This resulted in precise projects like this one, for instance. This is a sports pavilion they designed during the pandemic. Other architects began writing much more than before, and I can continue the list. So all these small bridging experiments devised by architects reveal implicit creative mechanisms of the ordinary functioning of practices and make them rethink existing creative habits, the existing hierarchies and expertise in the practice. This new effort of thinking more before doing, of better articulating before expressing, might have looked absolutely impossible in the profession before the pandemic, and it is now an unfolding reality. Step two, the second move, stepping aside and speeding up. So architects also step aside, looked around for different tools and technologies that were available in the field, and they began exploring and implementing architectural and IT tools that were there before, but were not fully implemented in practice. Some of these technologies were there during the first digital turn, around the 1990s, and we're talking mainly about tools for form finding and mass customization, or in the second digital turn around the 2000, where we're talking mainly about tools for thinking like BIM and other tools. But all these technologies developed during these two different turns were not fully implemented in all practices around the world, and of course, depending on the scale of the practice as well. For instance, BIM, and here I quote architect Eric Shin from Shin and Partners Design Studio in Guangzhou. He tells me, although BIM has been promoted over a decade ago in China, it wasn't broadly applied until the year 2020. For its coordination character, provides a synergetic working platform for architects and engineers from different disciplines. So thanks to the pandemic, Shin and Partners completed 2 projects last year with BIM tools used through the whole process, and they consider this a historical moment for the practice, prompting the use of these tools to be mobilized now according to their full potential, inevitably changes the way practices operate. In other practices, in other parts of the world, we have seen other developments, like the pandemic accelerated the use of web-based project management tools like Asana, which was introduced in 2008, but implemented now. This is the practice of Adriano Rapassi, Brazil. And in other practices, we are now moving to Israel, where we see another practice. It's a small-scale practice, QH architect, talking about how the pandemic also prompted them to enhance and update technological infrastructure, moving to the cloud, trying to use much more technologies which were there before, but now they became savvier, tells us Eric Eller. I quote him, the pandemic, he said, accelerated many processes that were already under consideration or in the middle of being executed. This is a small scale practice. While for the bigger practices like Seven Architecture in Manchester and Harrogate, UK, for this practice, for instance, the pandemic enhanced the process of pulling resources from different offices, different branches of the same firm, pulling those resources together, which increased the awareness of the different projects in the firm and also the collective responsibility. Thus, stepping aside, looking around and repopulating the practice with all the new tools, architects started rethinking their working methods. And yet we are far from another big digital revolution, because there were a lot of critics who argued this. We are very far from another big digital turn or a big change that we can situate in the cultural history of digital technologies in architecture, as some critics have argued. Instead, what we witness with this anthropological inquiry is a curious infra-digital development at the level of practice, which can be better captured with the tools of architectural anthropology. These technological developments triggered little differences, minimal actions that redefined the working equilibrium of each practice. And the third step, shaping new compositions. Instead of choosing between physical and Zoom worlds, architects engage also in inventing new ways of communicating with clients, with communities, which resulted also in hybrid compositions. The Sydney architect Urzi Grau described the situation from a project in Australia. When travel restrictions in Australia prevented them from meeting their clients and the community they were designing for, they had to figure out a way to meet their clients. They were working for an Aboriginal community in Morin Bridge, not very far from Sydney. So it's this project involved extensive consultations and close communication with the community leaders, service providers, and the general public. But completing these activities online proved extremely challenging as clients wish to meet the architect in person. And this particular project, the Morin Bridge project, is an extension of a local preschool and community hub. And I quote Urzi, preschool kids response to a face on the screen is different from in-person interaction with an architect. So working with Aboriginal communities in Australia requires building trust, and Zoom's corporate environment does not help us to do this. So they had to think about a solution, and to complete the consultation processes, they resorted to surrogates. They found collaborators, surrogates of the architect, of themselves. So they had to find their own surrogates. They found collaborators which were already in the area. They prepared and briefed them. They trained them how to act as an architect, what to say as an architect, and the architects themselves acted as stage directors, giving instructions for a strange play. I quote, these sessions were strange and exciting as we witnessed through a screen someone else doing our job. Yet our voice coming out of a laptop could not compete with the physical presence of our surrogate, end of quote. So we see that architects not only had to redesign their offices, to think about creative design solutions, promoting well-being and care, but they also had to design their own surrogates, their own presence in communities and on the site whenever it was not possible. Another hybrid method of meeting the client was offered by a Berlin architect, Fabian Brenne. They were in charge, his company Brenne Architekten, they were in charge of a big, the renovation of a Renaissance chateau, which started in 2019, and during 2020, it was in a design phase. So usually to discuss the plans of such a building, and it's a very, very long building, 300-meter long, they would print the plans and they will bring them in the meeting room in a meeting with the client. But this was not possible now. I quote Fabian. Since the building is over 300 meters long and the work involves the entire building, the discussion on the plan online via Zoom is particularly tedious. The plan can never be displayed in its entirety on the computer without losing the readability of the details. So it was not possible, and they had to look for a solution. So their solution was to hold planning meetings on site, but outdoors with masks. Here they are, you can see them on site, close to the building area that needs to be discussed. They will walk around the building, take some of the plans, inscribe traces from the survey in the plans, and go back to this display of plans. All these are extracted in A3 and are placed on the floor. So this settings allows architects to take decision, and decision could be made on the spot, and also enables the building to be literally present in the room of discussions, and its materiality interferes in the decision making. So these are just some of the typical moves I encountered during this experiment with architectural practices. In conclusions, the pandemic prompted architects to rethink the state of things in practice and generated a new accountability. Architectural practitioners became more realist, and their activities gained depth that was not possible before. As Bruno Latour wrote in his most recent book, After Lockdown, learning to step back is what will deconfine us, and that's exactly what we have seen happening in these practices. Going back, slowing down, rethinking, repopulating and resituating their practices. Architects made visible what their practices truly depend on, what they are attached to, what they engaged with, and what has no implications for them. Each practice, in a way, in these descriptions offered a unique composition, a unique solution to the challenges of the bridging experiment that the pandemic was for everyone. By introducing this transforming movement, COVID-19 acted as the element of metamorphosis, triggering an improbable, complex, fragmenting, and bursting movement, dancing like a wall of fire, changing the state of things in architecture. And yet, there's no big radical change, but a movement that gradually introduces these little differences, these minimal actions. All these adjustments in the format and rhythm of design making bring more awareness to the entire material, spatial, and human machinery needed to sustain the specificity of the type of practice we call architectural. Felt like a shudder, each of these changes makes our practices tremble around their stability and eventually regain equilibrium. The pandemic also leads us to rethink the social dimension of architectural studies and question the methods of architectural anthropology at the time of social distancing. If we look at sub-maps of the architectural discourse, and this is something I'm currently working on, so it's still work in progress, this looks at publications in key architectural outlets during the pandemic, so from March 2020 until recently, until September this year, browsing a large database and trying to map the architectural discourse. We can, of course, using this type of readings, this type of distant readings of the current situation, as Franco Moretti called this type of approach, we can get a different understanding of these transformations in practice. Here, distance, of course, is not an obstacle, but a specific form of knowledge. We can see on a map like this, we can see fewer elements, hence a sharper sense of their overall interconnection. And what I was talking about stands right here, the challenges to practice in community and design, which is a very small part of the overall changes that we were able to map by looking at this transformation. So what we see here, that to fully understand the current challenges, we cannot rely on either distant reading through these maps and graphs to see the broader trends, or the close lens of ethnographic readings of specific pandemic adjustments in practice. The pandemic prompts us to invent novel formats of inquiry that can replace actual contact and immersed observation, not with digital equivalents. I'm not arguing that we should entirely replace them with digital equivalents, but with a network of investigatory tactics that can be deployed together. A network that can connect close situations like this, like close specific situations, like the situation we see in practice, with distant readings, qualitative with quantitative, and reading so as to intensify the depth of the inquiry. So when combined, these methods can generate a better anthropology-informed historiography of the present. In conclusions, just as architects are the first to design the new choreographies for the pandemic city, architectural anthropologists should be the first to rethink qualitative research methods at the time of social distancing. And this is the real challenge for us now. This will inevitably trigger a new cross-fertilization between architecture and other fields, and I would say a promising future for architectural anthropology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albena. In a way, it's interesting that you ended up giving this lecture online, because it illustrated some of your own points about new hybrids, right? That we could not see you, your voice was here and then your slides. And in fact, in a way, you were here on the screen up under the ceiling. So that's kind of a new way of presenting and being present. But we have time for a very few questions and comments, if anyone wants to. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I don't know so much about the practicalities of architecture, but I really enjoyed the pictures that were quite illustrative. And one of the things that drew my attention was all these mansplaining men in the pictures, and I was particularly fascinated by this guy with the brick. He was like posing. So I wondered whether your study on this particular rupture has also affected issues of power and relationships within the discipline, and you mentioned a little bit about hierarchies. So that was one question. The other one was about the surrogate, which may be a little bit in line. It seems super interesting to be called upon to sort of conjure up a surrogate of yourself, sort of like, who am I if I am to explain how you should be if you were to be me? which could maybe be an interesting also avenue to talk about sort of myths and perversions about idealizations of the architectural figure. So I wondered whether these two things were also part of your study and your analysis in terms of power and idealization.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Can you hear me without the headset?
Yeah. It's quite loud.
All right. Right.
No problem.
It's okay, yeah. Yeah, well, that's a very, very interesting question, and it kind of refers to what Tim was saying. We should treat this setting as a site of experimentation. That's exactly what happens in this kind of major experiment that we see, that the pandemic kind of set on practices, and power is indeed extremely important here, because we can see that through some of the online devices, through some of the online techniques, not just for communicating, but also for designing together, because there was a lot of digitally enhanced sketching that was promoted, a lot of digitally enhanced sharing of the screen and sharing of the pen, so designers can in a way find the equivalent of those spaces that they have in the design practice, but replicate them on the screen and still be able to see the same screen and design together. So all these kind of replicas that were invented were extremely interesting as technologies, but also as settings created by the architects. They also had to replicate the spaces for informal communication, because in every single office, informal communication is extremely important. Sometimes the best decisions or the most kind of interesting solutions are found in the coffee break, in the breaks between two important meetings. So this kind of informal communication, or jumping into another project when you are out of a meeting on your own project, and then witnessing another model. So this kind of informal encounters, it were difficult to replicate in online spaces, but architects thought very carefully of how to design, how to craft those spaces for informal communication, and there were some architectural solutions of those spaces as well, including how to craft their own presence with the surrogate example as well. This so design creativity extended from the careful redesign of the space through to the design of digital replicas of the social channels of communication and their own kind of creative persona. In that sense, we can witness this mega site of experimentation, and this was a free inquiry. I didn't ask specific questions about power or about surrogates, but this emerged in the experiment with the practices as something that they pointed to, something that they considered relevant out of the many different levels of experimentation that happened in the practice. In terms of power, we witnessed an interesting development as well, because with the digital tools, with everyone sharing the same screen and hiding behind a screen, some of the typical hierarchies that we have in practice, the boss and the kind of hierarchical structure of the office, especially in small and medium scale practices, are entirely flattened. And we can talk about some kind of democratization of the process. We can talk about some kind of empowerment of the younger designers who now feel more included, feel much more empowered to talk, to express their opinions, to take risk even, and to write more. So they were also given more responsibilities in terms of writing and participating in different stages of the design project, which was not the case before, because when in kind of normal conditions and before the pandemic, these designers often didn't have access to some roles and responsibilities. So we definitely see some kind of reshuffling of hierarchies, power structures, and roles and responsibilities, especially between architects with different expertise and different architects from different generations as well.
Okay, thank you, Albena. This is a very interesting discussion, but I'm afraid we will have to continue it at some other point. I'm sorry that you are not here, so we could discuss further over a glass of wine, but we will have to do that the next time you are in Denmark. So thank you very much for joining us now, and Tim also, if you are still with us. Thanks again to all of you for coming, and please hang around for a while. There's some wine and some snacks just outside. Thank you.